Let's talk about 2027 because the maneuverings, alignments and realignments are still keeping Nigerians up at night. Well, depending on how you take a look at some of these developments. Over the past couple of weeks, Nigerians have become inundated with all of the political rhetoric as well as positionings by key figures ahead of what promises to be yet another showdown in 2027. So let's try to make sense of some of these recent movements, what you can make of it, and how best to understand the different maneuverings that is unfolding right before our eyes. Someone to help us navigate this is none other than international investigative journalist and political commentator David Hundeyin. David Hundeyin is joining us virtually via Zoom, of course, in a very peculiar circumstance this morning. David, thank you so much for joining us on the program. It's good to hear from you again. I'd just like to start the conversation this way. You've written recently about some of your frustrations with some key political figures, one of them being Peter Obi and his not so clear message about what he is going to do in 2027. But give us an overview of what you make of the landscape right now. The APC is obviously trying to reposition its ranks right now for maximum utility in 2027. And we're also seeing the opposition, or at least the coalition, beginning to show some sort of promise about what is to come. What do you make of all of these positionings?
Generally speaking, as you mentioned, there are two camps that seem to have some sort of clearly defined idea of what their strategy for 2027 is going to be. So obviously the incumbents, the ruling party, have a very clear strategy. The opposition, not so much. So the supposed coalition that we've heard so much about, obviously with figures like the former Minister of Transportation, Rotimi Amechi, former Governor of Kaduna State, Nasir El-Rufai, former Vice President Atiku Abubakar, Rabiu Kwankwaso, and Rauf Aregbesola, a few people like that. They appear to be coalescing into this supposed coalition, which isn't still quite set in stone. And then you have Peter Obi, who is like the sort of the radical, the free radical, if you're familiar with that term in chemistry. No one is quite sure whether he's with the coalition or he's going to run as an independent. And you described it as frustration. my concern in all of this was that I think history bears this out, that unseating an incumbent anywhere in Africa, but especially in Nigeria, has only ever been done, to the best of my knowledge, it's only ever been done in 2015. And the only reason it was an achievable thing then was that the entire opposition coalesced into one force behind one candidate. There was no split opposition at all. There was only one opposition in 2015. That's what made it even feasible or possible at all to take power from an incumbent. So in this situation, it looks as if there are indications that the coalition might not end up being the only significant opposition to run in the election. And the likely scenario in that case is that we basically have a rerun of 2023, where instead of a showdown between two actors, we have a three-way dogfight, and the incumbents end up winning almost by default, not because they won the election, but because the other two lost, which is what happened in 2023. If you look at the official figures announced by INEC, the APC received, I believe it was 36% of votes cast, which is a frankly dismal showing. But because the other two major opposition positions weren't able to come to an agreement before the election, so we ended up having a situation where the opposition scored close to 60% of the total votes in an election, which should have very comfortably put someone else in power. But because there was a split opposition, we ended up maintaining the status quo. My concern is that could end up repeating itself in 2027. And unfortunately, it doesn't seem as if we're any closer to seeing any resolution in that sense, because both both parties, both the coalition and the third force candidate I mentioned earlier, don't seem very willing to concede ground to each other. As far as I can tell, Peter Obi's position is that the coalition should back him. The coalition should give him the ticket to run in the presidential election, and the coalition's position is that he should run as a candidate in the coalition's primary elections if he wants the ticket.
Right.
He doesn't seem to think that that is something that he should do. So again, we're stuck at this impasse where, for all the money in the world, it looks as if we're going to end up going into the 2027 election and end up with three major, candidates, two of them being opposition, and then we end up having a split opposition vote, and essentially the ruling party ends up remaining in power by default. Right. Which, from my perspective, is like the worst possible outcome. Speaking from a biased perspective, that's not an outcome that I would like to see. But unfortunately, it does seem as if we're heading in that direction.
Well, you take a look at what APC has been up to lately. It has been trying to bolster ranks, right? You look at the political movement heavily in its favor. It's like the biggest stock right now. If we have like a stock market for political parties, the APC stock is really, really up. Indications are that more of these governors are likely going to join. The governor of Kano State has been rumored, is well within, is on the brink of actually joining the APC. I mean, you see the compromise in Rivers, for instance. It's no secret that other south or southeastern states are also likely going to join the ranks of the APC. Now, the resignation of Abdullahi Ganduje means that they have a lot more options to play with. What do you think the APC is working at here? And what kind of a problem could that be for the coalition if that is what is going to end up looking like a very strong, a much stronger APC than the one they faced in 2023?
So the APC strategy now is the same as it's always been, and the strategy is basically to fragment and fracture any possible opposition as much as possible. So the idea is, we don't necessarily have to win a 70-80% landslide. We just need to make sure the other side doesn't win and remain in power by default. And how you do that is that you poach some key characters that could end up coalescing some more of the opposition around them. So you've mentioned some of those names. So it was kind of, bear in mind, these are the same characters who did the exact same thing that the current opposition is trying to do. They did that in 2015 successfully. They figured out how to fracture and fragment a political base and basically take advantage of that division for themselves. That's how you had entities like the NPDP forming out of the PDP in the run-up to 2015, and all those shenanigans. So I guess they experience is the best teacher, and they're simply reprising what they've always done, which is fracture and fragment the opposition and ensure that the opposition basically doesn't dedicate enough time to fighting the incumbents. They rather spend more time in fighting and bickering, fighting each other, which is, by the way, is exactly what is happening. So unfortunately, as much as I dislike to say it, it's a successful strategy. It's succeeding in front of us. We're witnessing the success of it. And if I were a betting man, despite the fact that it's not something that I would like to see, but if I were a betting man and I was asked, who do I think is going to be successful in 2027 election, as it currently stands, I would have to say it's the APC, unfortunately.
All right. I mean, obviously, you have your own political, alignments there, but talk to me about the position of Nigerians here. It appears that we're dealing with a paradox of choice here. More means less in terms of options. What do you think Nigerians are dealing with here in terms of their options on election day?
I think, realistically speaking, anytime there's an election between an incumbent and a challenger, it's essentially a referendum on the performance of the incumbent. That's really what it is. So it's really for the electorate, it's a choice between more of the same, the so-called continuity, or a rejection of that status quo to try something new. That's what it should be in practice, which is why the best case scenario for the opposition would be to unite and solidify itself behind a single candidate and make it a very simple choice for the electorate. That doesn't seem to be happening in this case. In this case, it seems as if the narratives we're hearing around the run up to 2027 sound very similar to the narratives we're hearing in the run up to 2023. And 2023 was not an election between an incumbent and a challenger. It was an election between two new people. So ordinarily, the two conversations are not supposed to be the same. But unfortunately, that's what the Nigerian electorate is being presented with now. We're hearing candidates, saying things that sound almost as if they're still in sort of 2022 campaign mode. They're still referencing their past records and this and that. This particular type of election is not an election on what your past record was, whether you are qualified, whether you have the competence to do it. That's not what this kind of election is about. This kind of election is supposed to be a referendum on the performance of the incumbents. That's what it's supposed to be. Unfortunately, those who are running the opposition now don't really seem to understand that, and they're sort of almost like campaigning against each other unofficially. So we could well end up with a scenario, as I said earlier, where on election day, Nigerians end up with a solidified ruling party, a solidified incumbent which has a solid strategy, which knows what it wants, and it's clear. And then two or three opposition options, which essentially all end up failing because there are too many of them. So in a sense, it will almost end up not mattering who Nigerians do or do not vote for if the opposition doesn't manage to get its act together and unite behind a single electoral force. So we could end up with a situation where even before the election day actually gets here, the elections have already been decided simply because the opposition has fractured and fragmented itself. It's what you call an unforced error. And unfortunately, we seem to be witnessing a live action replay of 2023 all over again.
Right. It's quite the conundrum, isn't it? Politically speaking, you have an APC on one hand who is appearing to be too big to fail because it is growing stronger and stronger with a lot of these accumulations of defectors from the opposition joining its ranks. And on the other hand, a coalition that has all the promise and potential, but with a very big question mark on its head. But give me your best and worst case scenario for the coalition, especially if they have to answer that Peter Obi question.
Okay, so best case scenario would lie with Peter Obi himself. And it will be a scenario where, regardless of whether he gets that presidential ticket or not, he's able to commit to work with the coalition, and he's able to relay that message to his support base that regardless of whether he gets that ticket or not, because I cannot stress this enough, there's absolutely no guarantee that if he were to run in the primaries, that he would win the ticket. Right, so this idea that it has to be a foregone conclusion that he has to get the ticket, unfortunately, is not an idea that I agree with. In as much as he's a candidate that I have a personal affinity for, I care about Nigeria significantly more than I care about him, and I think Nigeria needs a strong opposition now. So, if he's able to relay to his voting base, to his support base, that everybody needs to collaborate, needs to work with the opposition regardless of who the candidate is, then best case scenario, we get to election day and it's a simple binary decision between the incumbents and the challengers. As I said, a simple referendum. Do you want APC to continue based on their record over the past 4 to 10 years, or 4 to 12 years, or do you want something different? That's the best case scenario. Now, the worst case scenario is that, first of all, there's no clarity in the short to medium term. We keep on sort of drifting closer and closer. The 2025 comes to an end, and then maybe sometime in February 2026, the coalition then finally holds its primaries, and then maybe shortly before the primaries, then Peter Obi decides that maybe he has seen indications that he's not going to win the ticket, and then he pulls out and he decides to run independently, which is what happened in 2022. And then we end up having this bitter, acrimonious intra-opposition civil war 1 year or 11 months to the election, which would be to the benefit of nobody else but the incumbents. And then we get to election day and we end up basically splitting the opposition's votes 2 or 3 ways. And then the incumbent ends up getting probably even an even lower vote share than they got in 2023. Maybe instead of 36%, maybe this time they get 29%, but it's still enough to push them over the line because the opposition basically ties itself up in several knots. So you have a Peter Obi, then you have a coalition, then you have another person, and then the opposition splits its votes 3 or 4 ways, which is a very feasible scenario, unfortunately. So those are the best and worst case scenarios.
Yeah. And right now, would you say the PDP has lost its position or is losing its position as the main opposition candidate? Because the coalition seems to be the main focus of the administration. I mean, the president could not stop himself from attacking them at every given opportunity. He seems less concerned about the PDP. What do you make of the PDP as a third option?
So I think unfortunately, the PDP still has to be taken seriously because it still controls, I believe, the second largest number of lawmakers and governors in terms of political parties in Nigeria. So it still has to be taken seriously as an electoral force. However, it's clear that at the national level, the party has no strategy. The presidential candidate of the party in the 2023 election has maybe one leg in and one leg out right now. The current minister of the FCT, who is a member of an APC-led administration, is still technically a card-carrying PDP member. And that contradiction has still not been resolved. So it's clear that this is a party which still controls some significant electoral heft, some significant political heft, particularly in some parts of the north and in some parts of the south, especially. But unfortunately, it's losing that power. It's losing that credibility with every election that goes by. It just keeps bleeding and losing more and more, hemorrhaging more and more of that legacy that it built from 1999. So I think the ability to rebuild the PDP lies in the hands almost exclusively of Atiku Abubakar. So it's his decisions or lack thereof in this election cycle that will determine, I think, whether PDP will continue to be a thing going forward. Because bear in mind that between 1999 and 2015, when PDP lost power national at the federal level, that was about 16 years. And now from 2015 to 2027 is 12 years. So basically, the upcoming election makes it just 4 years shy of the mark that PDP was at when it lost power. So if PDP doesn't manage to get its act together in the 2027 election cycle, that would mean that the APC would have been in power effectively for as long as PDP was in power, which I think would have then successfully relegated the PDP to the status of like a permanent also ran, a permanent opposition party, which I don't think is the legacy that it was created for. So we have to wait and see.
Right. And talking about the APC there, I mean, you obviously say that they could be beneficiaries of the fragmentation happening on the other side. But what could go wrong with the APC? Because we're also hearing some grumblings from within about people who are not necessarily happy that some of these runaway PDP governors or opposition governors joining the ranks of the APC only to, take over the structure of the party at the state level, and they're not necessarily quite happy about some of these movements. How do you see the APC handling some of its newfound success, especially with some of the political elites?
It will do what it has always done, but specifically under the current leadership that the APC has, the current national leadership, the current president, the solution to such problems is always a transactional solution. So if anybody's unhappy with something, then bring the person to the table and negotiate a deal. That's all it will ever boil down to. So unfortunately, as Machiavellian as it appears, it's very successful. it works in Nigeria because the people who are dissatisfied, as you put it, are not necessarily dissatisfied out of any real ideological basis or grounding. It's purely a transactional thing that we're here before you. We're supposed to have access to this and that, and this person is an interloper, is a newcomer. Why does this person get to do this and that? So if I am dissatisfied in that way, all you have to do is call me to the table and throw me a bone, offer me something to pacify me. And the current APC leadership are experts at doing that. So I think that's how they're going to navigate it. They're simply going to find enough bones to pacify everybody and just keep it rolling for as long as they need to.
Right. Okay. Let's talk about INEC for a moment now, because it has also come under the radar. A lot of scrutiny from some of the people you mentioned earlier, especially members of the coalition. The former governor of Rivers State, Rotimi Amechi, who is a prominent figure in the coalition, has been quite scathing about INECs. We understand that some of these applications are still pending, even though the national chairman of INEC has come out this past week to dispel some of those concerns and say that the commission is going to do justice to some of these applications as contained in the law. But INEC's neutrality has been questioned yet again. Do you have any concerns about what has been said so far, and do you worry that INEC is dealing with a very big integrity question going into 2027?
I think it's fair to say that INEC definitely has a big credibility question hanging over it, and I think this has always been true, but this is especially true going into 2027, especially given that the person who was the INEC chairman in the 2023 election cycle is still the chairman. So nothing functionally has changed materially. So that question mark definitely does hang over them. I think the bigger question mark than just the leadership of the INEC or its ability to conduct free and fair elections is also the political will of the current administration to even hypothetically create a situation for INEC to even have that possibility of carrying out a free and fair election. I think it's fair to say that based on the antecedents of the elements who are currently in power, I think that would be a very, very optimistic notion that they would knowingly and willingly create the conditions for them to potentially lose power. I don't think that's how these people operate. So I think INEC does have a whole number of questions hanging over it. And I think for these questions to be even remotely addressed or dispelled, maybe we're not going to be fortunate enough to see a revision of the Electoral Act like we did in run up to 2023. Maybe nothing significant is going to happen, but at the very least, there should be some signs. There should be, for example, the ongoing discourse about the registration of the so-called ADA party, and the very clear sort of the gamesmanship being deployed should already make it clear that if the simple process of registering a political party, something which, if as long as the preconditions have been met, this thing shouldn't take 10 minutes, right? It's not a very big deal. And already that has become a national story that we're discussing on Trust TV. And it's just a simple registration of a political party. Then what happens then on election day, where you have much weightier matters to be decided? Who is in charge of making those decisions? These are issues which have not been resolved. I've spoken to a number of players in and around I'm trying not to sort of potentially compromise anybody's identity, but I spoke to people with knowledge, inside knowledge of INEC, and honestly speaking, it doesn't seem as if there is the slightest institutional ambition to change anything, to show anything different in 2027. If anything, it's looking as if there is appetite for things to get even worse. And to be fair to INEC, this isn't an internally driven thing. This is something that is coming from upstairs. I know it's called the Independent National Electoral Commission, but it's not really independent functionally speaking, because it's funding and then the appointment of certain key personnel are political decisions. And unfortunately, the people who hold that political power now are not in the slightest bit afraid to use that influence and wield it to sort of, influence the electoral process and things relating to the electoral process. So we're definitely going to have that question to answer, I think, in the run-up to the election and possibly even on election day itself. But I think we have to be realistic enough with ourselves to say that.
And, your realism, is it informed by something suggestive from the administration itself that it might put its thumb on the scale in favor of the APC in 2027?
Well, again, not to give anybody's identity away, but I've spoken to someone who has very intimate knowledge of, for example, the shenanigans that were deployed, the internal INEC shenanigans that were deployed during the most recent election that was conducted. I believe it was the Edo State election. And based on that case study, which is something that I'm going to be expanding on in the coming few weeks, I'm probably going to publish something on it as well. Based on that case study, if that template is deployed at a national level in 2027 election, then we're going to have a scenario where potentially whatever people actually, thumbprint on the ballot paper isn't going to have any sort of an impact on the result that is announced, because based on based on the information this person provided to me, the internal players, obviously on the instigation of political power, the internal players have figured out a way to effectively game this new electoral system that has been deployed with the IREV and the BVAS. These things that were supposed to be fail-safes and technologically foolproof, the internal players have figured out how to game these things, how to rig these things, and make it such that the numbers that have been predetermined or pre-allocated to candidates can be inputted and then made to appear as though these are the actual figures coming out of the electoral process. Meanwhile, they were not. And what really alarmed me about it is that this is not a very high-tech thing. This is not it's not about hacking machines or anything like that. This is a sort of biro and paper process, because despite the technology that has been deployed into the electoral process, there's still some sort of weak points between the what's it called, the polling units and the so-called collation centers. Within the collation centers, there are certain points where data needs to be recorded on paper, and at those points, it is the easiest thing in the world to simply swap out certain things, and then the sort of the data that could be used hypothetically in an electoral tribunal to compare from what is recorded electronically to what is recorded on the paper, for you to show that there's a discrepancy. Even that data, there's a way to rig it as well, such that it appears as though what was recorded electronically and what appears on the paper are the same, right? That is the scenario that we have. So, and the person who provided this information is an active internal player, right? This is not an outsider. This is not gist, right? This is not gossip. This is internal information. So if that has been deployed successfully in the Edo State election, I see no reason why it will not be deployed at federal level and across many other state elections in 2027. So where hypothetically we can end up with a scenario where the ruling structure effectively awards itself a nationwide landslide that did not happen. So I think, which is why it's important that on platforms like this, the topic is raised now, the alarm is raised now, and I'm going to do my part to raise the alarm in the coming few weeks that the electoral process is not by any means foolproof, that the technology that has been deployed people have found a way to actually completely end run it, to completely get around it, and that those points of weakness need to be addressed for us to even claim to have what we refer to as an election.
Right. Obviously, definitely a head scratcher there for a lot of people listening to this information firsthand from you about the electoral umpire and the quality of the next election, or at least the credibility of the next election. Just before we go, David, let's talk about the elephant in the conversation. Politically speaking, regionalism has become pretty much the buzzword lately about who is allowed to be on the ballot or who is accepted on the ballot for some of the major political platforms. It does appear that we're working with an unwritten rule that the South is going to have the run for the next 8 years. Now, for the next 6 years, because the Tinubu administration is already 2 years plus in right now. How do you think that shapes the conversation for the other side? Because apparently the president is going unopposed with the ticket of the APC. But what about the other side? How do they have to factor that into their equation?
So ideally, you would, if you had asked me this question maybe in 2022, I'd have said it's obvious. They have to present a Southern candidate. However, I think based on what happened in 2023, certain political conventions in Nigeria that we thought were set in stone were completely upended and the sky didn't fall down. Nothing happened. So, for example, the political convention that a national ticket should ideally have a Christian and a Muslim, that's a political convention that has existed since before I was born. And in 2023, it was broken and nothing really happened. You know, the country hasn't fallen into a well or something. It still exists. It's still functional. So clearly, if that could be done and nothing happened, then I think the people who make these political calculations would have looked at the situation of the coalition, for example, and decide, you know what, it doesn't really matter so much whether the candidate that is presented is from the South or from the North. That's not really the issue. What is the issue is what candidate do we think is going to bring in the numbers that we need? So I think that's what the calculation is primarily going to be focused on this time around. I know that there are many in the space who kind of hope or even expect that the unspoken convention of regionalism, or there are other terms that we use to describe it, that these unspoken conventions will hold, and that these will be used primarily as the determining criteria for who gets what tickets and whatnot. I personally don't think that is going to be the case. I think precedent has been set that these are conventions, these are not rules. They're basically just gentleman's agreement. It's not written in the constitution anywhere. Yeah. So we'll have to wait and see. But personally, my thinking is that it's not going to be as much of a factor as it once was.
Feels like a version of the uncharted territory right now. David, fantastic analysis as always. Thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you for taking the time despite the rather unusual conditions that you're dealing with. Thank you so much for your time this morning. I appreciate you for the analysis.
Thanks for having me.